Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this FLV Global interview. My name's Colin, and so thank you all for joining us via YouTube or podcast. Today, I'm really thrilled to have a new guest on this webcast. It's Mr. Jonathan Dickson. He's the Vice President of International Corporate Services at OTC Markets. He'll be discussing today's RNS from Genflow Bioscience, giving us insight on its upcoming listing on the OTC and advising us on what impact this may or may not have on the American biotech scene. Based in sunny London, Jonathan is responsible for working with companies around the world, helping them navigate the complexities of the US markets, and he's also an expert in assisting companies access the capital so they need to grow their businesses. So, without further ado, let's get started and welcome Jonathan to the show, shall we? So Jonathan, man of the moment, welcome to the webcast. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. Everything's happening as usual. With dad's back in Dubai and mum's away, but yeah, we're good, thanks. You've been busy in the office today?
Yes, I've been out at a conference this morning, charged back to the office for this, and then back onto it this afternoon. So thank you very much for having me, appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure. It's really thank you for joining us and taking time out, as I see of your somewhat busy and hectic schedule. Now, look, everyone knows where what and where Dubai is, but not so much the lesser known emirate of Sharjah. And I'm mentioning this because, well, you were born there several decades ago. So can you tell us something about your career to date and how you transitioned from being an expat in the UAE to the VP of International Corporate Services at the OTC?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yes, by coincidence. So I was born in Sharjah in 1983, so I'm turning 40 in a couple of months. My brothers were also born in Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. My parents were expats out there, and Dubai was a very different place back in the early 80s than it is now. And then I came back to boarding school relatively young, went to university, started my career in the city as an investment manager for 10 years. I co-managed a branch of Redmayne Bentley in Fulham and managed mandates on behalf of clients throughout the UK and Europe. And then this opportunity about 5 years ago with OTC Markets came along, where it was such an interesting place, such an interesting market. People look at the US all the time. So I transitioned over to capital markets and investment management, and haven't looked back since, really. It's been really interesting help global issuers access the US capital markets.
So one thing that's been bugging me, if the OTC market is American, why are you working and living in the UK?
Yeah, good point. So the OTC market is predominantly a secondary market. There are US domestic listings. However, the majority of the market, the companies which cross-trade into our market in the US are actually international, and they have their primary listing outside of the United States. And one of the reasons they do this is there is an SEC exemption which allows them to cross-trade from their domestic market, their primary listing, whether that's London, Frankfurt, Euronext, Paris, it doesn't matter. The more established disclosure-driven exchanges around the world, they have access to the US via an SEC exemption, which means they can have a US dollar quote in US market hours for US investors, but without the cost and complexity of full SEC reporting that you'd get on the likes of NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange if you were doing a traditional dual listing.
So does that mean you travel to the States a lot, or you just basically stay in London?
Yeah, so I'm back to New York a couple of times a year where our head office is. Our compliance team are based down in DC. We have a Aussie desk, which is run from New York, a Nordic desk, which is run from New York, and we've just opened up an office in Singapore. So the majority of my travel is mainly Western Europe. I spend about a week a month, well, not quite that, but a week a month in Paris. Euronext is a big market for us, as is the Deutsche Börse in Germany and other markets throughout Europe. So it's a big educational thing. It's driving the education around US capital markets, and specifically the SEC exemption and the ease of access for companies of all sizes that are public to access the US.
So, I mean, that must be great for local access in London. Of course, it's a big capital market there so you have somebody on the doorstep to go and speak to if they want to list in the States.
Yeah, that's right. London was a natural place to set up our first overseas office from New York, just because of the ability to get into Europe, which is a big area for public companies. A lot of international companies from all around the world elect to have their primary listing in one of the European markets. So it made sense for me to be in London so I can get to Paris and Frankfurt, Madrid, etc. relatively easily. and then do the educational piece with those companies and the advisory network on the ground in these countries, which I'm sure being able to be in front of people and being able to deliver the message in person goes a long way to helping people get a full understanding of what we do.
Yeah, I think that'll make a big difference. And has Brexit affected you at all? Is that going to make your job worse or better?
Yeah, it's a good question, because Brexit, funnily enough, whichever side of the fence you sit on as a market, we kind of remain agnostic, because it's, companies will be driven to list in London, but at the same time, if they're not going to London, they're going to Paris or Amsterdam, which are other markets which we work closely with. And if they have their primary listing there, because they don't elect to go to London, that's fine. Other companies will continue to list in London. The irony of, I suppose the USP of what we do is the fact that because we are that US secondary market, broadly speaking, we're agnostic as to where that primary listing is. And the reason being is it's the same service, it's the same exemption, which gets them their access into the United States.
Look, I must say the OTC seems a sublime marketplace for early stage and developing companies. And I really think it's a brilliant move by Genflow to gain access to the US markets. In fact, I was reading recently that the OTC currently hosts over 1,000 companies. So could you start by giving us an overview of what the OTC market is and its benefits for business listing with you, please?
Well, OTC Markets Group, we are a stock market. In the same way that the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are stock exchanges, in many ways, we're not too dissimilar. We are a trading venue for over 12,000 securities around the world, of which our market is broken into 3 tiers. We have the pink open market, which is an open market for a lot of companies that want to have access to the US. There are very low standards of disclosure and compliance around that, but it is still an open market. And you will find New York NASDAQ D-lists, you'll find level 1 ADRs from around the world, you'll find reorganization companies and a combination of others. Above that, we have OTCQB, which is where Genflow have applied for, which is our venture market, where you'll find about 1,300 companies, again from around the world. And these are generally smaller venture stage companies. A lot of them are pre-revenue that are looking to get into the US to access that depth of capital and liquidity in the US. It's obviously the US is a massive market, the world's biggest market for discretionary ability to invest in international securities or domestic for that matter. And then above that, we have OTCQX. That's our premium tier, what we call the OTCQX best market. Now on there, you'll find the likes of Sainsbury's, Adidas, Roche, Heineken, EasyJet, Marks and Spencer's, big global brands that want to access the US, but do not necessarily want to fall under the SEC's remit. So as I mentioned earlier, by having that, what's called the technical term is a cross trade to the United States to access US investors, you're essentially getting access to the United States as a public company without SEC reporting, without complying with Sarbanes-Oxley or reconciling to US GAAP, because you're relying entirely on your home market disclosure from, in this case, London. The SEC recognizes the financial and compliance and disclosure standards of the London Stock Exchange, where they have said, well, actually, we are going to allow an SEC exemption. It's called 12G32B. It's not the most exciting term, but it's called 12G32B.
I'm sure you have many sleepless nights over those numbers and figures.
Yeah, I can give you a book on it if you want. It's the foreign private issuer exemption, which again is that window into the US for international companies to have a cost-efficient, compliant way of accessing that depth of liquidity in the US. So that's, as a function, that's the primary reason we exist, is to give those issuers access to the US markets where they wouldn't ordinarily have had the ability to do so. There's a misconception that US investors, particularly retail, can access international securities on exchanges around the world. It's just not true. The mechanics, the plumbing, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't exist. And there is also, beyond that, there's a compliance function. You want to be on a fully regulated market, what is called an established market from the established public market from the SEC. So there's trading, there's compliance, there's visibility. It's the ability, again, just for that access, that window into the US.
So it sounds like it's pretty robust compliance requirements, which of course will provide investors with transparency and confidence in the companies they're going to invest in.
Yeah, absolutely. So the companies that join our market. So Genflow, for example, I mean, they have an application in with us. There's due diligence that we will be doing. There's due diligence outside that we will be doing. We do at times reject companies because they have not hit those financial compliance and disclosure standards. So we have to. That's the reason there is this ability for these companies to go through that process. Now, by and large, because they have their primary listing outside of the US and they are on an established, robust market like the London Stock Exchange, they will, in most cases, be able to get through and get to the OTC QB or QX market as and when, because of those standards in the home market. But yes, from a US investor's perspective, it gives them confidence that the SEC have rubber stamped this effectively through the exemption for US investors to access these international securities, sometimes of which are not very well known in the US, and they're making that first step.
It seems that companies that list on the OTC have a pretty easy access to a pretty large and liquid market. But how do the OTC market, support these emerging companies like Genflow and I guess subsequently promote their growth?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So let's focus on the fact that we're a stock market. That's the primary function we are. We create a two-way quote through the market makers which plug into our market, which feed into the investment community, like the Merrill Lynch, the Vanguards, the JP Morgans, the Merrills, everything that you could think of, all the banks and brokers which are taking that trade feed are plugging into our market. So that's the first thing. Second thing, compliance. Part of being on our market is the fact that you have been, as I mentioned earlier, rubber stamped via the SEC exemption in order to have that access into the US. So you have something called Blue Sky. Now, Blue Sky compliance is the ability for investment managers, brokers to be able to recommend overseas companies to their to their managed money accounts, of which, if you join OTC QB, you get a blanket Blue Sky exemption across 34 US states. And we add 1 or 2 states every year or two. So this is a constant mechanism that is driven by us. The third thing is the visibility. To your point, how do we help these companies grow into the US? Again, we are a market. We have to be relatively agnostic to the point that we have to, our function is a stock market. But there are certain things. So, for example, if you have a look at the OTC Markets website at the moment, you'll see we and I have recently done interviews with the head of investor relations at Akzo Nobel and Heineken, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's, big global brands that they want to access the US and trade on QX. We'll do that. We do that for a number of smaller companies as well. We have strategic relationships with third parties like Proactive Investors. We have a podcast series for OTC QB. We acquired the Virtual Investor Conference from PR Newswire a few years ago now, it must be 5 years ago now, which came into its own in the pandemic, which is where a London-listed issuer can film live into the US, into a virtual conference that we market on their behalf, up to 90,000 US retail institutional investors and financial media. And they can film that live with a Q&A, a one-to-one, and that ability to deliver their story and their value proposition into the United States. And we actually give that information back to the company after they've done that, so that they have those contact details for their investor outreach down the line. Press releases from the UK, they upload that to their system. We push that into the US. So there are these things that we do in order to help drive it. And then aside from that, we have relationships as the US market for these international companies with third-party advisors such as investor relations, public relations, investment banking, audits, accountancy. So if they do need help on their US access, we have those relationships in place where we can make a third-party introduction.
That's a lot.
We'll try.
So, I mean, it's a massive access, of course, to a broad network of investors and brokers, it seems. It's, beneficial certainly for a company that wants to develop into the States. Just looking a bit more at Eric and Genflow, I see that, I didn't know, but Eric recently, or has been a CEO of a previous company in the US for 3 years, a company called Dandrit. And I believe he's already built a pretty impressive investment banking network in America already, which of course, could provide extremely valuable, or will be extremely valuable in the near future. So look, with that in mind, how will Genflow's US-centric approach fit into the market dynamics? And what potential impact might it have on the biotech industry in the US?
Yeah, I think I'll start with your last point there, and then I'll come on to Eric and Genflow afterwards. The biotech and life science space in the US is, well, it's a very well understood sector in the US for a start. US investors, both retail and institutional, and everything in between in the UK, let's look at family offices and third and fourth tier investment banks. It's the same in the US. There is just a better understanding of smaller growth companies in the United States than there is here. So that's primarily one of the reasons that they've made that move. So this, by and large, the sector they're in as well, it's very topical. We know that Eric's just been over there as well. He's met with our team at OTC Markets. He has experience with the OTC market before, which is really good. So when I had our initial conversation around it, I skipped halfway through the conversation just so we could get onto the points around Genflow specifically. And his plans over there. And yes, I mean, you mentioned the investment banking thing, and I will take a slight detour here because I should have mentioned earlier around how the trading works in the order there, because that's quite important for Genflow's UK domestic current shareholders and how they're going to see this trading work should they get the traction in the US that they're looking for. So very simply, the way OTCQB works. So there are the same market makers which quote in the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are also quoting OTCQB and QX. The amount of market makers is driven by the appetite of those market makers for that particular international security. So let's assume we have a two-way quote, which is a US dollar conversion of their London sterling price, of Genflow's current sterling price. Okay, so let's assume on a retail basis, we'll keep it really simple for this. Mrs. Smith at Merrill Lynch in Chicago wants 10,000 shares of ABC PLC that's already on OTCQB. Merrill Lynch will shoot that to our market. It'll hit that market maker at the top of the book, which could be Citadel, which is commonplace in our market, Citadel are. Citadel will then trade that straight into London. It will trade, settle, print in London, boost liquidity in London, sit on the local register as Merrill Lynch. However, Mrs. Smith at Merrill Lynch in Chicago has 10,000 shares of ABC PLC in US dollars in her account as a book entry. If the company was paying a dividend, she'd get those in US dollars. Corporate actions are sent by Merrill Lynch. It's a very smooth process for access to the US. They're not splitting liquidity. It's not like a New York or NASDAQ stock exchange split of liquidity like you would do across both sides of the Atlantic. The vast majority of that trade volume is going to go back to the home market in London, boosting liquidity, which should in theory please everyone, because liquidity as a function of the markets is essential. So that should be good. So, I know I've taken a detour there, apologies.
This is for the shareholders and they love hearing these things. They're going to ask these questions anyhow, so please diverge. Yeah,
it's relevant to get these points across because there are misconceptions around how the trading works. There are misconceptions that it's a synthetic ability for US investors. It's not. The trades are getting clipped in London, reported in London. They can't be reported in New York and London. It's got to be one of them.
So a question on that then, John, is so I use Interactive Brokers. Will they trade on the OTC markets? Is it easy for me just to use that account and trade?
If you've got a US account, yeah. So think about the OTC markets as broadly exclusively set up for US investors only. We do have trade feeds to other parts of the world. So we've just taken one in the Far East by an institutional broker that wants to get access to the OTC market. But by and large, think about it as exclusively set up for US investors, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the biggest pool of capital in the world. So that's why it's primarily there.
Excellent. So look, I just want to hark back to one of Genflow's recent RNSs, which relates to their potential treatment for a non-alcoholic liver disease, or NASH, which is a non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. When you consider that, I think out of about 35 million cases worldwide of NASH, a staggering 16 million sufferers live in America. And bearing in mind there's no current treatment apart from a liver transplantation, what do you think will be the potential impact on Genflow's addition to the biotech industry in the USA?
Yeah, that's a good point. At this stage, I still just have to caveat to say that the application is in with us. Pending, likely, but pending approval. So again, aside from being the biggest market for capital in the US, the biggest depth of liquidity in the world is the US. It also has its functions as a population, and also if you're a biotech or life science company, your biggest contracts are likely to ever be in the US. And if you're looking for FDA approval, you're going to be wanting to be in the US. If you're selling any form of drugs, you want to be in the US, just by nature of the way their healthcare system works. Specifically for Genflow, I think more topically, just by nature of the very specific sector they're in, it's very West Coast, let's face it, it's something that's quite interesting for the people that live on the West Coast. It's very driven, longevity, health, it all speaks to the West Coast. For my colleagues in New York that are listening, I'm not suggesting they're not healthy. I'm not going to live to 110, but I'm just saying. So yeah, I think broadly speaking, it's a new dynamic, and there are peers in the US. And I'm sure what Eric has done is over time, he has looked at his peers in the US. It might not be specific. They might not be in the exact area that they are in, but he can probably see valuation gaps and probably looking for a fair valuation. Not looking at hyper valuations. And again, I'm not an investment banker. I'm not a corporate advisor. All I can do is speak on behalf of the market. There's a number of reasons that these companies do get access to our market is to seek fair valuation with their peers in the US.
I mean, I know he went there recently to the East and West Coast and spoke to lots of very important VCs and banks, and there was a large interest, and I think there was a lot of excitement for him. Hopefully, if you all agree, he's going to get on the markets and start listing in the States. So yeah, fingers crossed for Genflow and Eric then. So fantastic, Jonathan. I know you're a very busy man. I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights on the OTC markets and giving your assessment of the impact on the Genflow possible listing. It's been an absolute pleasure having you as my webcast guest today, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So would you like to come back in the future and discuss, well, hopefully if Genflow get listed, then we can discuss a few more things related to that.
Absolutely, I'd love to. Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. And for our listeners, thank you all for tuning into today's webcast. I hope that our brief discussion has shed some light on the OTC markets and its benefits for emerging companies like Genflow Biosciences. If you have any further questions or would like to learn more about Genflow or the OTC markets, please join our dedicated Telegram group or contact us directly at genflow@firstletventures.co.uk. Once again, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast informative and useful. I wish you all a pleasant day. Thank you.